there's a scale that was developed in the early 2000s to measure the extent to which you have autism spectrum-like symptoms. It's been used often with university students. The notion here is that it's a dimension and that there's a normal distribution and that to some extent all of us can be characterized on this distribution. It's mostly getting at empathizing versus systematizing. And I'll show you some of the items. And this has been shown to predict diagnosis, and I'll show you some of the research. So I like things the way I like them, and it upsets me when people try to interfere with my routines. I think all of this is on a 1 to 4 scale. You can get this online. I took it myself. It's not a clinical diagnosis. It just gives you information that you might find useful. So that's about the, liking repetitive things. When working on a project at home, I sometimes focus too intently on small details, and I lose sight of the big picture. The third one is a social item in text messages and social media. Sarcasm and tone of voice are lost on me. I take things literally and get confused as a result. I do that a little bit. I'm not very good at irony and sarcasm. I don't pick it up so quick. But there are people who really have trouble and almost never can get sarcasm. And that's an indicator of being higher on this dimension. Loud noises, pungent smells, and certain fabrics are physically painful for me. I'm not sure where that item comes from, but that's one that distinguishes people who have autism from those who don't. Conversation doesn't flow easily for me. I interrupt or talk over people. I finish other sentences. I speak in fits and starts, especially with new people I don't know. I probably would have endorsed that when I was 18. This one I got a kick out of. My family members lovingly refer to me as the eccentric professor because I know a lot about the topics that interest me, but I tend to go overboard. And you will find people, actually I remember another kid I met who probably had this disorder. We were at a national park. We went to one of these teaching sessions by a wildlife expert, and it was about birds of prey. And there was a boy there who was around 10 who kept interrupting and correcting the park ranger. And it was clear that this kid knew more than the park ranger did. So eventually the park ranger got smart and enlisted him as his co-teacher. But the kid knew everything about how fast the birds come, how quickly they change direction. So I thought back, and no one ever referred to me as an eccentric professor. They refer to me as an absent-minded professor. It's a different category of professors. I'm not really very good at details. When I'm having a conversation, I tend to look at the wall, shoes, anywhere but directly in the eyes. I think I do that a little bit, and it unnerves people. But it's even more striking for people who are on the spectrum. Something that I used to teach, I'm guessing it's still true. They did some research with autistic kids and regular kids or kids with different disorders. And what they focused on was what you pay attention to when you're talking to another person. And the two places you could look are at people's eyes or at people's mouths. And it turns out these two things are not equal. Most of emotion is communicated with our eyes. So, and what they found was that people with autism, they looked at the mouth, and the mouth doesn't tell you that much. It's the eyes. There's so many muscles around the eyes, and they could identify that there was a difference. My memory is like a steel trap, even for facts I don't fully understand. And I'm very good at math and music. So among people I know a mathematician where he shows some of these characteristics. I don't think it's at a clinical level, but on the spectrum. Now, what you can do is you can give the autism spectrum scale. I'd rather go a little further. Autism spectrum scale, and then give the big five. And the leading researcher in this area, his name is Simon Baron-Cohen, and I think he's the brother of Sacha Baron Cohen, who's like this funny comedian. I have to confirm that, but I'm pretty sure. He's the one, well, Borat, that's him, thanks. And autism, so he did a study. He's the one who developed this autism spectrum scale. And the question was, are autistic traits an independent personality dimension? And the study isn't that strong. He just got 320 Japanese students to complete both scales. To measure the Big Five, he used the very best Big Five scale, which is a 240-item scale. And what he was interested to see was which of the Big Five traits are associated with scoring higher on autism, and also whether, if you did a factor analysis, autism would come out as a sixth factor. Yeah? The cousins. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. It's not good if you do online shopping, but if you do online research to answer my questions, that's really good. So here is the results, and this is just the correlations. And what you can see is that there are associations so that the ones that are significant here are the being higher on autism spectrum is most strongly related to extroversion. And that means there's an association between scoring more toward the introverted end, the detached end, and being higher on this autism spectrum. It is associated with neuroticism too, so there's some distress, some negative emotions, and my understanding from Ina Weinberg, that's particularly true for high-functioning individuals who are autistic. And I once read an article that there are fewer women who have autism, but the women are more likely when they're 13, 14, 15 to have real difficulties because for girls, I'm not sure if this is true, but navigating the social hierarchy and the social connections is more complicated than for boys. And so for females who have this autism spectrum, they have a more difficult time in adolescence than the males would. It's not just a matter of going and playing basketball with someone. It's more really understanding a lot of nuances. So it makes sense that neuroticism might be higher. And the final thing is conscientiousness is lower. I want to highlight again that a common mistake is to think obsessive compulsiveness is something that will lead to higher conscientiousness. And people who have autism, they're very repetitive, they're very detail-oriented. You might think that would be associated with conscientiousness, but it actually makes it hard to pursue important goals because you'll get caught up in little details and side issues and rituals and things of that sort. So it's negatively related to conscientiousness. When they did a factor analysis of the Big Five and the autism questionnaire, they said that the autism questionnaire came out as a separate factor. And so they would argue that it's distinct from the Big Five. I question how they did this because they didn't use the individual items from the two scales. Instead, they used subscales, and they put all the subscales in. And when you do that, you end up getting 4 of the Big Five factors coming through, and then all of the autism spectrum items come through together. I should have mentioned that here I present the results. This is neuroticism broken down by facets, and this is extroversion broken down by facets. And the most striking thing on neuroticism is that the 2 facets are depression and self-consciousness. So people with autism, they're more likely, or university students who score higher on the autism spectrum report higher levels of depression and self-consciousness. In terms of extroversion, they're lowest on gregariousness, just wanting to be with people a lot. They are very much not like that. So this was, it was a first study. It's useful to get us thinking. But since that study, there's been many others, and many of them were even better. Rather than just using 2 scales with the university population, they would sometimes have teenagers where they would have parents' ratings of the kids rather than self-reports. And they also had some studies where they had diagnosed psychiatric diagnoses on autism sample, and they compared them to. So there were about 15 studies where you can compare things. And the studies that are called correlational effects mean that they just use questionnaire methods, and they measured the Big Five traits, and they measured autism spectrum on a questionnaire, and they correlated. Sometimes the questionnaire was completed by parents, so it's a little bit stronger. The group effects are where you have identified young people who are diagnosed with autism versus those who are not. And sometimes they're diagnosed with other disorders. So it's a clinical control group. Skip the publication bias. What I want you to focus on is effect size estimates, which are presented as Pearson correlations. And no, actually it's presented as z-scores. No, these aren't Pearson correlations. These are D estimates. But in any case, just look which ones are higher. They're actually all significant. So that this study, which is a meta-analysis, a quantitative review, shows that autism is associated with every one of the Big Five traits, and in every case it's with the socially less desirable end. But the strongest associations are with extroversion, I would say, and also with emotional stability. Now, one other thing I read that I found interesting is that you can find there is some heterogeneity among individuals who had been diagnosed with Asperger's. So you can find some Asperger's individuals who are higher on extroversion, higher on conscientiousness, lower on neuroticism. So they have a more adaptive Big Five profile. And it turns out that if you have a young person who's 12 years old and who has more of these who's more toward the socially desirable end of the Big Five traits, it's more likely that at a later point in this young person's life, they won't be diagnosed anymore as having autism spectrum disorder. And that's because they don't have that much difficulty adapting to school, friendships, and other kinds of things. So to some extent, when an individual has autism or Asperger's, they're more likely to score low on the Big Five traits. But if they are scoring higher, that has some predictive value. Okay. So here's a picture of Greta with her parents. Her mom is an opera singer. Her dad is a filmmaker. She has a 13-year-old sister who also had severe problems. She has attention deficit disorder. So both kids had problems, yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you after class. I have so much material to go through. So as I told you, when she was 12, she had depression, OCD, selective mutism, anorexia. So I'll skip this actually. I'll just tell you quickly, there's other studies that have compared the big five traits based on clinical diagnosis versus control groups. And generally what they find is for depression and for anxiety disorders, what's most noticeable is lower extroversion, lower conscientiousness, and higher neuroticism. For substance use, extroversion is not associated with it. Instead, low agreeableness is what you see. But, yeah, so generally speaking, these are the patterns of results. And I was afraid this would happen, but once I got into the kind of thinking about the diagnosis and the comorbid diagnoses and how they relate to the big five traits, I'm kind of getting very specific and kind of getting a little obsessive. And I think I'm losing the picture of what Greta is like. So you saw her give her speech. You saw her give another speech. Some of you were sitting close by. You might have her on her, you might be like Instagram friends with her. My daughter's Instagram links with her. And I think most of us just see her as a fascinating, interesting person. And she herself would say, I know I have Asperger's, but I see it as something that's been a gift to me because it lets me have a laser focus and it lets me speak the truth and not worry about the consequences. But what Dan McAdams would say is, Kestner is probably focusing too much on the big five. And when you want to know a person well, you have to go beyond that. So I think we could characterize Greta on the big five. I think she's an exception to the findings I just told you about in some ways. But what McAdams would say is, think about someone you know really well. What is it you know about them that you don't know about other people? And he would say it's not traits. Traits are easy. Traits are superficial. Traits are like, you know, I have a certain way of walking, a certain way of talking, and it's easy to pick up and characterize. And he would suggest that we quickly pick up the big five traits on other people. But the people we know well, we know them well by knowing what their life is like, what it's been like in the past, and what it may be like in the future. So we know something about their life story, and it helps us understand them, it helps us think about them. Now, part of this knowledge is you know about their desires, needs, wishes, wants, goals, challenges, values, and the unique way in which the person puts them all together. And that's what makes us unique. That's what makes us feel like we know another person. It's putting all of these other things together after we've quickly identified the big five traits. So the three levels that I'll be teaching you about, the big five traits, I'm not quite done with that. I have one more class on that. But the second level I like to call personal concerns, and it's about aspects of personality that describe motivational and developmental things. And then the third level involves the life narrative. And here is something you saw early if you read the preface or the prologue. McAdams believes different levels of personality come online as we're growing older, so that we're born with our dispositional traits. They're probably genetically, biologically determined. You could pick it up on temperament in the first year of life. And it tends to remain very stable. The second level has to do with goals and values and motives, and it's about being an agent, doing things because they're interesting to you, or you value them, or you want to achieve them. And I would suggest that's the level that you probably want to understand Greta. She is an agent. She's a catalyst. She's active in creating something out of her life. She's been able to get millions of people engaged in what she considers the most important issue of our lives. So it's at the level of goals, values, and motives. And that comes online at about age 6, and it becomes more and more important. And she is now getting to be 16, 17, and something else comes online then, and that has to do with putting together a life story, a narrative that makes sense of who we were, who we are, who we're going to become. Greta has a really challenging task. She has to make sense of why for several years she suffered from all these other maladies. And even though Asperger's was a gift, I doubt that she would see the depression, the anorexia, and the OCD as a gift, and the selective mutism. But she has to make sense out of why that happened. And she also has to start having a story for where her life will go from here on. So that's, McAdams refers to it as personality as an author. Now this is what we're going to do in the rest of the class, the rest of the course, so that among personal concerns, I will be teaching you about 3 different motives. Motives has to do with kind of experiences that you like to have, the things you find rewarding. The 3 motives I'll tell you about are achievement, and people who are high in the achievement motive, they like to master tasks, they like to develop skills, they're always focused on improving and getting better. And some of us are very high on that, some are low, most in the middle. But you can characterize individuals in terms of where they are on a dimension of achievement motivation. Affiliative motivation has to do with being preoccupied and interested in social relationships and how you're getting along with people. Some of us are very high on that, others are low. The final motive that I think you'll find most interesting is power motivation. And that has to do with wanting to have impact and influence, to shake other people up, to win them over to your side, to have a lasting impact. And most of us, when we hear power motivation, we say, oh boy, I'm not sure I want that. But I'll show you that we need people who have high power motivation, but it has to be a controlled kind of power motivation. Of the 3 motives, I would suggest there is crystal clear evidence that Greta is remarkably high on power motivation. She's tuned into how to get people's attention, how to get them engaged, how to change people's minds, how to motivate. She has energized a worldwide movement. The way she started it is she decided to go on strike on Fridays from school and instead go to the Swedish parliament and, talk to people and carry a sign about how we have to stop what's happening to the climate. So I think understanding about power motivation and how power motivation can be a very positive, useful thing if it's a social change that one is trying to bring about, helps us understand her better. After I talk about the three motives, I'll talk about developmental stages, psychosocial stages. The idea here is that at different times of our lives, we're preoccupied with mastering different tasks. When you were younger teenagers, the fundamental task is being competent, doing things well, behaving well. That's why you had so much energy to learn badminton or classical Greek or other kinds of things. The fundamental task of young adolescents is being competent. As young adults, you have a much more difficult task. You have to figure out what your identity is. And the identity has to do with important things like, do you believe in any religion? Do you have any political values? Do you know what you want to do for your career? And at your stage, the fundamental thing is to be exploring a lot of options, but making commitments. At the same time you're doing that, you have to struggle with the intimacy stage, which is how to relate to other people, how to develop truly reciprocal, meaningful friendships and romantic partnerings. And then there's a stage after this, usually associated with people who are at least 30, and it's called generativity. And this is where your focus is on doing something for the next generation, leaving a legacy, leaving the world a better place. This is where I should be at. This is where our political leaders should be at. This is where your parents should be at. And some of us, we are doing small things. Greta is probably the most generativity-oriented person you could imagine. And coming from a 16-year-old who looks like an 11-year-old, it's quite stunning. So already, I would say, besides the traits, power motivation and generativity status are very interesting. But you might wonder, how did she jump ahead? How can she be doing what we would expect Barack Obama to be doing? Or we would expect Justin Trudeau to be doing, someone who's in their 40s. How is a kid doing this? The danger is, the way these psychosocial stages work is, you have to take care of each of them, and you can't skip. So with Greta, you might want to go back and look at identity and see whether she's really explored different kind of identities and whether she's made a commitment after exploring. And what a lot of critics are saying is that she's actually speaking other people's words, and she's probably been shaped by her parents. Because her mom and her, the whole family wrote a book together when she started her movement, and there's a concern that at some level she's actually a puppet, and that she's been infused with the political beliefs and values and or religious beliefs of her parents. Now, when you hear her speak, when I hear her speak, I don't get that sense. But something that would be useful to do is to figure out, has she wrestled with the challenges of identity? I'm kind of nosy. I won't look into this at all, but I'm also curious about intimacy stage and friendships. And that's going to be really difficult because she's She has autism. Okay. Beyond the big three motives, psychosocial stages, the next thing will be goals and values. I'll also talk about attachment and autonomy. And then I'll talk about life narrative. You can analyze your life story the same way you would analyze a novel. Are you telling a comedy or a tragedy? Are you telling a dramatic, exciting story? I think one danger with Greta is it sounds kind of messianic. It sounds like I'm going to save the world. And I think she's trying to do that. But it's a risky story to be telling about yourself. And it will be interesting to see whether she changes and redefines that story. She's actually just beginning the process. The final thing I'll say, though, is that they've actually found that people who have autism have a hard time telling their life story. They can tell you the factual things of what they did, but they can't really tell you what it meant to them. So it will be interesting to see what Greta does with that. Sorry for being disorganized today, but the good news is you have no class Thursday, and there's so much material on Greta, you can go out there and read a lot about it, and I recommend that you do that. Thanks a lot.